Welcome to the DevOps Days DC Resiliency Engineering panel on COVID-19. My name is Victoria Guido. I'm the Vice President of Operations at Pluribus Digital and organizer of this conference and of the local DevOps DC meetup. I have three panelists with me today. I will give them a chance to introduce themselves. First is Dr. David Woods, one of the founders of Resilience Engineering. Do you want to say hi, David?
Well, I want to thank you and for including us. I got started in taking resilience engineering into the critical digital services world and software engineering through John, who's on the panel. And what he showed me is that you are the perfect place both to succeed and to demonstrate what happens when we get into trouble in terms of following key findings and principles in resilience engineering. So you're a key hallmark for the future for everybody, as well as ways to improve what you've already done to build resilience so that the systems work as well as they do, despite the fact that your success leads to more growth, more relationships, which means that your success has to become a new success as the situation changes and grows in capability and scale.
Excellent. Thank you. And we also have Laura Mcguire, who's a researcher at Jelly. You want to say hi, Laura?
Hi there. Yes, I also got brought into this world through John. We were both attending Lund University in the master's program of human factors and system safety. And I started to see a lot of overlap between things that I was seeing in natural resource industries around risk, around adaptation, and around coping with complexity. And I did my doctoral research with Dave Woods, focusing on distributed incident response practices in DevOps teams that were responsible for critical digital services. I'm happy to be here today.
Well, thank you for joining. That's very exciting. And John Allspaw, John Allspaw, who is the founder and principal at Adaptive Capacity Labs and a major person in resilience engineering as well.
Yes, hi. My name is John. I'm the only panelist without a PhD. I would say, but when I do, everything's over. Yeah, my background is in software. I have a relatively annoying habit of addiction of asking questions, and that led me to Dave's work. And I am looking back now, some many years later, I'm pretty pleased with how we and others have been bringing these perspectives, some of which are pretty unintuitive, from resilience engineering into the software world. So yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Great. Well, I'm very excited. And my first question for you, for those who don't know, what is resilience engineering? If you can give me a brief summary of an entire field, and what might help as well is to add an example of resilience engineering in action during the pandemic. So since John, we ended with you, I'll start with you this round.
Oh, okay. Well, I think the other panelists would be, it would be good for the other panelists to weigh in as well. Let's see. I'm going to punt a little bit on what is resilience engineering. The thing that comes to mind with regards to the pandemic is that conditions and investments, things that are set out beforehand, maybe even without a lot of justification for doing those things, is what made adaptation possible across on every scale, at every level, from supply chains and the huge amount, myriad of medical, the monitoring, the tracking, the collecting, the analysis of data, the production of a vaccine, the role that digital services, online services played in keeping society actually running as well as it did, is it's an excellent example, many excellent examples of what resilience looks like in reality. That's my high level, abstract, generalized, incomplete answer.
Sounds great. Well, then I might try the person who wrote the book on resilience engineering next, David Woods. Would you be able to give us a brief description of what is resilience engineering?
So the thing that's very simple is resilience is a verb, right? My colleague in starting this, Eric Hollnagel, says this all the time. It's about how you do things, what you can do, and it's a very specific class of verbs. Right? It's not nouns, it's not a state, so be careful with that. It's about what you can do, and it's about what you can do in the future when conditions change, when surprise occurs, right? When what you thought was the way your system worked, what you thought were the challenges you had successfully designed it to handle, turns out to be incomplete, and the world throws surprises and challenges at you. New forms of stress, new forms of difficulty and overload. So the key definition, now resilience in 15 years ago was a very odd word that very few people used, and mostly when I started using it in 2000, I got strange looks. I know that's a word, but what is it and what does it mean? Today it is ultra hyper popular in contradictory ways. So the best thing to do is remember not what resilience stands for, but what adaptive capacity stands for. And that's your readiness, right, or potential to change how your system currently works, right? The models behind it, the plans, processes, behaviors, to continue to fit changing situations given new forms of anomaly and surprise. So the simple phrase is being poised to adapt. And this is the idea that you have to make investments now in order to be ready to respond to new challenges in the future, right? And you have to be ready to revise, right, your processes and models and understanding in order to do that. The challenge for us from the beginning was that most of the systems we have are competent. For example, we have good reliability statistics in our digital services, but brittle. So they fail or risk failing and collapsing at the edge of their envelope when new challenges arise. Now, the trick here is the biggest driver of surprise at the boundaries of your system, things that's going to reveal where things don't quite work the way you thought, is your past success. Because your past success leads to growth, and growth leads to new scales, new relationships. And so now we end up having these problems where issues arise that are small, right? So take the Fastly outage. We've got obviously the Facebook outage recently, which everybody kind of knew what trigger went on, but the surprise isn't the trigger. The surprise was what is a trigger that could be innocuous most of the time ended up setting off a bunch of drivers which started pushing overload to different places, saturating other parts of the system, leading in this case to loss of services because we didn't understand, and in fact we can't track all of the interdependencies. The Fastly outage is a great one. A small change in Sweden turns out affecting a third-tier software service that hobbles Amazon cloud services, which everyone thinks if I just put it in the cloud, if you're not involved in software engineering, automatically everything will be okay.
Great, thank you for that. That's a great explanation. And Laura, did you want to add on to that definition or any example you want to bring up?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I wanted to tease out something that Dave is kind of hasn't quite hit on explicitly, but is a big part of sort of how I understand resilience engineering as well. And that is the understanding of normal work. is what, in order to design these systems and in order to design technologies to support adaptive capacity, we have to understand what that is and where it comes from. And as Dave mentioned, it comes from the people working within these systems, their ability to make sense of what's happening in real time, to be able to recruit and reorganize teams effectively, to be able to cope with failures. And it's so the reason why this is important for the audience to know around resilience engineering is that there's a lot of tactics and a lot of strategies that they can use internally within their own teams to be able to understand what it means to do work in complex systems. And we'll talk about those a little bit later.
Well, we could get Victoria maybe a little controversial right off the start here, right? We can hone in, especially for the DC community. And one of our colleagues, your colleagues in all this, has asked the question, why do reliable systems fail? Right? I mentioned, and everybody knows, everybody has great availability statistics, and yet incidents threaten outages pretty regularly everywhere. And in fact, we have outages of valued services to our various customers and other organizations that depend on the service we provide. And what that highlights is a fundamental misunderstanding. And so I want to start right out by proposing, that the SRE name has missed something, right? Missed something very, very important. And so if we think of it as about, who's building the systems, not the site, the systems, because it goes beyond what looks like the site quite a bit, right? But it says reliability. Right? Let's change that SRE to S3RE. 3 R's? What are the 3 R's? Reliability, robustness, and resilience. And resilience in a very particular sense about adaptive capacity that's called extensibility. So resilience as extensibility is the third one. Those aren't the same. So all of a sudden, we start seeing that the thing of we can have high availability, which means we have built a system that is competent given our past experience and investments. We try to make that competent system robust to different kinds of disturbances, but which ones when we make it robust, we have to know which kinds of disturbances occur. Generally ones we know about or ones that have happened already. But as complexity goes up, that's insufficient in two ways. One is you can't be completely robust because you can't know all of the different pathways by which challenge will arise. Complexity makes that impossible, no matter how good you are, right? And that brings us into the third aspect of resilience as extensibility, that however you're working, you need to be able to extend or stretch at the boundaries when those challenges and surprises arise. Laura just pointed out, it takes special investments to build that resilience as extensibility. They're very practical. They can be implemented by many organizations. They're being aided by technology such as what's under development at Jelly. And this then feeds back and expands your robustness so that you can achieve all 3 R's. Right? The idea that we simply get reliability and therefore few problems should arise and we should always handle them smoothly is a folk model that simply isn't true. And the greater the success of our systems, right, and the greater the capabilities they can deliver, the more you have to pursue all 3 R's together. John, do you want to, you've been waiting for me to roll this out. I mean, we have a little video explaining it, but you also have challenged me a couple times that this gets in the way of some of the standards in the industry.
I dig. You've been working on this patch to submit for a very long time, and I patch accepted. This is I dig it. I dig it. The only thing I would say is that much like the evolution of DevOps or the spread of new topics, that associated with SRE or any other sort of industry-wide perspective shifts. This is that's what's happening right now. The fact that we are having this conversation and that tools like Jelly are emerging is evidence to me that that it looks like that this is not a revolution, not a wave, not a phase, not an era, but it's certainly a period of perspective shifting. And I think that's really important. The notion that what we've been calling, the industry has been calling resilience, really, if you poke at it, really it has the meaning of what Dave refers to when he says robustness. And I obviously completely agree.
So, Victoria, your experience is often in government software, right? Laura and John's are more in the commercial enterprise and SaaS systems. We've been talking a little bit about the differences because we've been asked by a variety of government agencies to talk about, how does this DevOps stuff really work? How can we bring more of it into government contracting on software systems? And certainly we've observed there's a pretty big gulf between the government contracting in the defense world, where the original revolution of continuous deployment that John was one of the pioneers of runs into some struggles when we look at the constraints of government acquisition.
Absolutely. In some ways, the government has more of a focus on what you could call robustness or resiliency. There's often plans to actually test failovers, and continuing operations is a focus, but there are challenges, and I would say the future is here, but it's not evenly distributed across many agencies. There are a lot of agencies who are very forward-leaning and who are in the cloud, doing agile, doing continuous integration, maybe not continuous deployment, and have made a significant progress into achieving some of those goals. Department of Defense, and certainly anything that's in a secured classified information network, presents challenges with delivering code without access to the internet, let's say. So there's certainly lots of different challenges and people trying to accomplish those. And you mentioned, David, that resiliency and robustness is about being able to recover in times of unexpected change or unexpected challenges that come into your system. And in the federal government, especially, I think COVID-19 brought some really unique challenges just in terms of really accepting remote work, really pushing the envelope on virtual environments. And I wanted to hear from each of you on what you think the themes that have come out of this COVID challenge has brought into the resilience engineering field. Anybody want to pop in?
Yeah, I'm waiting for them. Otherwise, I told you it was density. Yeah. So I'm trying to be quiet. You have to edit this out.
So a couple things come to mind. So you mentioned remote work, right? I think. Well, actually, let me back up a level, back up a sort of a step here. One of the core stances in resilience engineering involves trying to understand the resilience that is already present in the wild, right? And there's a paradox there in that if things, even if there are challenges, if they're handled really well, they don't tend to get much attention, right? And because that's just normal successful work. It must be because, and invent some sort of rationale. And quite often that rationale is not really grounded in reality, or at least not really supportable, or it's in a vague hand-wavy way. The messy details matter. There's the organizations that had never had people working from home or never had people working remotely, certainly had a harder time than people who who did have some experience and years under the belt doing it. Now, of course, I'll point out as an aside, there's working remote, having a remote friendly and sort of welcoming workplace. And then there's doing that in the pandemic, where all of your kids are at home and you or your spouse or your kids might be really sick. But having said all that, what enabled organizations to move to almost overnight, an entirely different way of working is gold. The opportunity is to understand how they were able to actually get it done in ways that are concrete, then ways that are grounded, and ways that what were the ways that they were able to adapt, and what made that adaptation straightforward, right? And so for the example that comes to mind, we know of a company whose core business, their service, is a SaaS service, and they provide electronic medical health records for hospitals, for clinical environments. And they hadn't been in a situation where they had remote engineers and they had to move to a world where they did have remote engineers. In addition to that, because of the nature of their business, let's just say that 2020 brought some particular challenges. That 2020 was very different for, let's say, telemedicine or all of the other things that needed to be put in place. It meant that they had to, in some ways, in some cases, postpone or entirely shelve what their existing roadmap was to and put some things, and accelerate projects that were aimed at things like telemedicine, things that they might not have been able to imagine working on until many years later. So the question is one of many: was that straightforward, or how difficult, and what were the difficulties in them being able to say, hey, remember that roadmap that we presented at the beginning of March? Yeah, so that's, and that we may have described to our investors and we hired people for. Yeah, that's kind of out the window now. What are the ramifications?
So in several of my interactions with leaders of organizations, one major software firm, others multinationals, what's interesting is they kind of all breathed a sigh of relief. We got through this. We're intact. In fact, maybe we did okay. Yes, it's a changed environment we have to think about, but there was almost a tangible sigh of relief in one of the panels I was on with these folks. And what was crystal clear is they don't understand what happened inside their own organization. Many of these attribute their ability to survive relatively intact, the stressors that emerged, to technology. And while technology in this case happened to be a critical asset because of the nature of the global shocks, right? I want to remind everyone that the next global shock, right? Remember Facebook took out WhatsApp, which turns out to be critical in many third world countries for all kinds of things, right? A small change in Sweden took out Fastly, which people didn't realize undergirded a variety of services. Luckily, were restored fairly quickly, right? All of the signs out there is the digital infrastructure that underpins everything could be the source of the next global challenge that organizations are dealing with. The fact that you were part of the assets for this one is purely incidental, frankly. Right? When we're in this kind of interconnected world, you could be sending the challenges everywhere instead of everyone using you to cope with these other challenges. Now, my point is, Laura, because what she's doing and what Jelly is doing with Nora Jones and others, to say, how do you really learn from these experiences? How do you create the pathways and interactions and facilitate those so that you could come back, that these executives could come back and say, oh, these really were the sources of resilient performance. This is where my organization is actually very brittle. And these are the kinds of things I didn't know we had as resources to draw on, which, as John and Laura have already pointed out, usually turns out to be people who use assets, sometimes like technology, in new ways to handle surprising challenges. So maybe Laura can talk a little bit about how we facilitate this learning.
Yeah, I think it's a big yes and to everything that's been said so far. There's a couple of things that I would tease out as being things that we explicitly noticed in research that we did kind of over the last 18 months, and particularly right at the beginning when the surprise was fresh and new and the adaptations that were required were very acute. So Dave's kind of pointing to this like acute, like the adaptation that has to happen right immediately, and then this kind of sustained adaptability, this ability to sustain this over time. And so in terms of a statement of what we saw was that successful adaptation was largely a part of frontline engineers, frontline engagement, and short cycle feedback. So the companies had to draw on their internal resources in ways that was unexpected and unanticipated, had to share knowledge in different new forms. And any of these sort of like previously established but smaller scale initiatives that may have been underway to sort of move towards remote work or to move towards these more flexible forms of reconfiguring teams and of sharing resources across the organization, those had to happen, those had to accelerate. They had to sort of lean into that kind of way of thinking about who do we have, what capacities do they have, how do we use that broadly across the organization to be able to sustain, given that things are constantly changing around us. So that kind of leads us to this conversation about like, what is sustained resilience? And Dave's pointed to the importance of learning, of creating these short cycles of feedback that an event happens, people make sense of it, or they make partial sense of it because they are sort of localized. They work on one part of the system. They may understand that they have interrelationships with other parts of the system. But how do we create these forums where we can bring multiple diverse perspectives from across the organization? Someone like customer support, who's able to talk about the experience of an outage with the engineers, as well as management who may be talking to regulators, to investors, to all sorts of different external stakeholders. So how do we create these feedback loops that allow these different perspectives and understandings of what are their goals and priorities? How do they shift across those goals and priorities in real time? And how do they let go of some of those to be able to just get the service back up and running to begin with? So there's the short cycle kind of forums to be able to create those interactions, as well as these longer cycles of reflection within an organization of who has knowledge, where does it reside within the organization? How quickly can we make that knowledge and skill sets and access to certain software components or physical data centers, as it were, to be able to react and respond in real time?
So Laura's helped us set up three key things for people to think about, right? And the first one is she mentions about tempo. How you've got to pick up the tempo and get when challenges arise. And this is where I said resilience is a verb, right? That you always have to think about you're on a vector, you're on some trajectory of how you're doing, how you're changing. What are you doing? What are you injecting? This is what John developed in continuous deployment. we talked about recently at a couple things and the history and what it means today. It's right how it's about your verbs and especially how this plays out over time. So what did we observe in some other sectors from colleagues of mine and our own connections, for example, obviously in healthcare, right? How variety of levels and roles that normally were outside of real-time clinical high-tempo operations all of a sudden became part of high-tempo operations. Otherwise, there wasn't PPE in order to help the clinical frontline staff, or they were making decisions that now had immediate clinical relevance. Organizations, everyone was trying to learn, right? What she started with is, right, the third of the trio, or the first of the trio, depending on which way you want to orient it, keeping pace, being able to up the tempo, being able to learn, being able to synchronize in the middle, right? That she also then talked about and was the subject of her own personal research, as well as applying it in the products at Jelly. And so what we observe for many organizations is their ability to up their tempo, or to bring roles in who had to now engage in a new tempo of operations from a fairly static, much more bureaucratic process, had struggled. They could up it a little bit. They could move from a walk to a shuffle, but to get to even to a jog was pretty tough. They could change direction a few degrees because it was forced on them. But they were just, the paths they worked through bureaucratically are so well worn and driven into the terrain that to climb out of those ruts for very long or to go very far was just too difficult. And so you can start to see how, without preparing the landscape and the resources, but the mechanisms, the dynamic, active mechanisms that allow you to be able to do things, right, at these levels of how do you keep pace? How do you anticipate what's coming at you in terms of shock or overload or saturation and bottlenecks that undermine resources in order to act early rather than react late, right? How do you integrate different roles? All of a sudden, a hospital director becomes part of clinical practice, or the way Laura just talked about it, because we have to share knowledge and experience over different parts of this growing tangled network of capabilities. And then we have to go back and continually update. We have to continually update because we cannot have a perfect model of how our system works. The complexity, the growth of capability leads to complexity, right? Which means no one can have a complete and accurate model. We can only get it by merging in dialogue the diverse perspectives and background of experiences. And of course, that plays out very dynamically in an actual incident response. So we see three basics that we've talked about for 20 years in resilience engineering, almost from the beginning, right? The positive is anticipation, right? Versus, right, we're slow in responding and we can't keep pace with the events and the challenges they present, right? We need to synchronize across new roles and levels of the organization. And do that at matching the tempo of operations in the first one. And then we have to be able to have mechanisms to revise and learn and change and update our models. So it takes what John and others started 12, 13 years ago in continuous deployment and kind of ratchets it up, and this continuous updating, continuous adaptability. Organizations have to be organized around being adaptive and changing. And many of the lessons outside the software world were that organizations that weren't organized around change struggled tremendously at great pain to match the challenges the pandemic threw at them.
I agree. And I think that some of the communication and that flow of learning and knowledge in the federal contracting world can even be sometimes set up specifically to silo and to prevent that kind of communication. I think that federal agencies have to be really careful with how they structure their teams and how they structure their acquisitions to enable that flexibility. I'm also interested in safeguards, one of our questions for today. Like, what kind of safeguards? Because the government loves to put in those rules and regulations. So, we're going to do resilience engineering. So we're going to do supply chain risk management reduction and require SBOMs for all of our software, or zero trust security, those types of guardrails. So John, you're shaking your head. I'm going to start with you. You seem like you have an opinion on that.
Sorry, yeah. Guardrails, safeguards, all of these are fine. These are fine, but they don't come for free. And so, for example, you could say that we only want to have, we want developer desktop laptops to be physically connected to the corporate headquarters or the headquarters of an agency. And let's say if you're traveling, then you've got VPN and you can get this and that, but you can't do everything because you're on VPN. And, the evil hackers are out there and you don't want, that sort of thing. Excellent. That's a great, it's a safeguard. That's a liability when all of a sudden you have to work remote. So think of, there's a common trope in the community is that if you look far enough, you'll find that DNS is part of every outage, right? It's always DNS. I don't know how many times we've come into contact with an incident where there's something working. I mean, something's busted or something's some sort of anomalous, sort of network broadcast storm or some sort of a lower level issue, and DNS is collateral damage. All of a sudden, people who have, let's say, SSH sessions still open to servers, the things that the policy was that you should never have to do that, but they had them open. All of a sudden, you were violating a policy in the one hand, and then all of a sudden there's an incident, and thank God they were violating the policy because they're already on the server and they don't have to resolve names, right? So safeguards, again, the safeguards are like procedures. They absolutely make sense to the author of them. The author of them cannot anticipate and imagine scenarios where those procedures or policies or safeguards or those sorts of things might be used or called upon, or might absolutely need to break. There's a paradox, a dilemma there, and we need to at the very least acknowledge it.
So we've seen that the government approach often ends up fragmenting and bureaucratizing the process in a way that runs in the exact opposite direction of being fluid in change, having high adaptive capacity. It puts a variety of barriers so strong that my example of even when challenged, maybe you really can't change the tempo and direction effectively in the way you who and how you synchronize. Now, we see this in industry too, and we see this in places where, again, fragmentation. We start having new managers running new shops who then have responsibility for one piece, who have to work with the manager and shop of responsibility for another piece. And the more you stand up these, the more difficulties that are going to arise in synchronization, updating, keeping pace with events. You're going to make it more impossible to have high adaptive capacity and be effective in these situations. So it isn't simply a government commercial barrier. It's really more about moving away from a highly fragmented, organization chart oriented. And that's where the guardrails and things, we're being defensive all the time, which will inevitably slow everything down. This would not work well. Irony for DoD is this doesn't work at all in actual military operations. Everything there is the opposite. In fact, besides clinical work in emergency rooms and ICUs and emergency medicine, one of our best laboratories, right, before we got to critical digital services was the military, right, where we have 100 and almost 200 years of history about who can adapt more effectively, recognizing things aren't the way they expected and readjust, right, leads to success, versus the laggards who are stuck in stovepipes and silos, et cetera. So it's very ironic that when it comes to other kinds of operations, including new developments that are software intensive, they go in the exact opposite direction that's needed. So it really is a kind of paradigm shift. It requires a kind of reciprocity and trust that you build together different units at different levels who are willing to work together. And there's certain commitments that get built up. And we've talked about these in some of the papers that circulate. The joint activity paper talks about this basic compact to align goals, to work to align goals. We talk about it in the work from the Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom, the first woman to get the Nobel Prize in economics till this year. Now there's two. But what did she highlight? That this notion of reciprocity that we can build on, that for these things to work, and the cases that John and Laura talked about, I have to be ready to stretch to help others that are at risk of brittle collapse, in the belief that they will help me if I'm the unit or the operation within the organization that's at the risk of being overloaded or saturated given the new challenge. So if we can build these kinds of connections, especially when things are tough, are getting overloaded and are different. And so we're not always working the same way. One of John's points about continuous deployment, they're not all the same, right? And we build up this continuous adaptability in how we work together. Now, the good news, the bad news is this is a big change for some organizations. It's a real radical redesign of how they relate to each other and what's the key priority. The good news is we actually have some pretty good guides on how to do this from a science fundamentals point of view. That this isn't just, okay, we can do it the way we feel like, or this sort of fits with our identity as an organization. Sorry, that's nice, and you might be okay intuitively. Sometimes in this industry, you've been actually pretty intuitive, surprisingly, and good for me, because I go, oh, wow, you guys had great insight. But we put it together and say there's a real science behind this about why some things work and other things are never really going to work. And that has now matured to the point that we're ready to put that into more practice if organizations are willing to join hands and invest and trial some new directions, which in many ways is like the way continuous development and deployment took over. Continuous integration took over on the commercial side in a relatively rapid fluorescence, as we would say in adaptive capacity speak. It was a rapid fluorescence, and we are in great need of some of the investments and initial seeds to stimulate a new fluorescence so we can move from things that end up being too bureaucratic and guardrail centered. Not that you shouldn't have guardrails, but they become centered around it, which means you will be defensive and slow when you can be sure that new challenges will arise that fall outside the capabilities that you knew about and planned for and stuff. You will need to modify how you're robust, and you will always need to facilitate and grow the sources that give you resilient performance when inevitably the next shock occurs.
I think I'll just do a final round, last final thoughts you want to share with the group, get some extra time, or
after my rant?
Yeah. Ranting is allowed.
I have some experience speaking Davish, and I think the translation would be play stupid games, win stupid prizes. I have nothing else to add. I think my hope, and here's what I would say to the folks attending DevOps Days. My hope is that this panel and other talks on these topics and other panels at other conferences generate discussion. That's how that's how we do, and that's how progress will be made to keep these topics alive.
Okay, thank you. Laura, do you want to add anything to that?
My fellow panelists are infinitely eloquent. I don't think I could top that, other than to reaffirm John's sentiment there that, you know, the work that you all who are listening today is doing is fundamentally changing and influencing society in ways that we are not even entirely sure of at this point in time. And so your voice matters, your experience matters, and you know, your ability to sort of advocate for the capacities to adapt and adjust in real time is important. And we hope that that's what a lot of resilience engineering is doing, is giving you tools to be able to, and language to be able to continue that work within your company.
You know, the continuing shocks, not just the pandemic, but the current supply chain disruptions. You know, a variety of things have happened and grown that illustrate a variety of brittle points globally throughout society. And that raises a big question we've been debating in a variety of circles around the world, and that is, do we retreat and go back? Can we go back to the comfort of the way we used to do things? Or do we reconfigure and in a quest to renew what's important, re-examining what the key priorities and relationships are, so that we renew our ability to pursue what are the key goals for our organization embedded in an interconnected human world that pursues and influences and aspires to a variety of successes for people, for real people. And we need to recognize that you can't go back. Right? We've changed. You know, think of anthropomorphic genesis of extreme climate events. Right? The world has changed in ways, and we need to rethink various forms of infrastructure in order to deal with extreme weather events. We have to reconfigure moving forward, and that requires a renewal, new relationships, new moments of reflection about what's really most important, and new ways of working together. And that's the opportunity now. The temptation is to pause and to go back to an image of what the world was like before, and try to retreat back into those old ways, which will actually narrow our ability to do things and narrow our ability to adapt moving forward. So renew or retreat, there's a great opportunity to renew and reconfigure how we do things.
I agree. And I think that it's incredibly critical to federal government and state governments who are providing that critical infrastructure for people who need to access services when there's power outage or emergencies. We were dealing with citizenships and all types of really important information, and it needs to come into the mindset of from everyone from acquisitions all the way down to contractors and people who are doing on the ground work. So I really appreciate you all coming here today and providing your insights and being such a wonderful panel, making it easy for me